This is Gemara Baba Basra Daf Mem Dalid Amid Aleph. And in order to understand what's going on, we have to go back for a moment and review a little bit of a difficult case that Rav Shishes suggested on the bottom of Mem Dalid Amid Mem Gimel Amid Beis, excuse me. And the case was Rav Shishes taught that the case is that Ruvain stole a field from Shimon and sold it to Levi, and Yehuda is coming and questioning the validity of this field, and Shimon wants to come and testify that it's not Yehuda's, and rather his mindset is that one day he'll be able to prove that Reuven stole it from him, and he'll be able to get it from Levi. With that understanding, the Gemara wonders, why does Rav Sheshes have to go so far with this case? Says the Gemara on the time of Dalim and Aleph, V'lukma begazlin. Why don't we just talk about the case where the Gazlan, Ruvain, stole the field from Shimon, and Ruvain now has the field, and Yehuda comes and questions the person who bought it. Why do we have to say, before Ruvain steals it from Shimon, before Ruvain sells it to Levi, just say the case stops right there. Ruvain stole a field from Shimon. Yehuda comes along and wants to say the field is his and creates an error, and say that Shimon can't testify that it's not Yehuda's. Why? Because Shimon himself is going to gain. So ask the Gemara, if what we're trying to prove over here is that Shimon has a vested interest in this field, beautiful. Why do we need the whole step of Levi buying this field? Says the Gemara, you know why? Because we wanted to say at the end of that brayso, machloi para machloi talis. We wanted to say a case where Ruvain sells to Levi a cow or a talis, and Shimon claims it's stolen. And in those cases, Shimon can, yes, testify when Yehuda wants to take it away. Why? Because in that scenario, where an item is stolen from Ruvain and then sold to Levi, and now a fourth guy wants to question. So Shimon was miyayish. It changed possessions. Then Shimon is able to testify that it's not Yehuda's. But if he didn't actually sell it to Hadralei, then it could actually be brought back to Shimon and lie. Therefore, Shimon would not be able to give Eidos. So Tani Reisha Nami Machar. So the whole reason and the Reisha that we're learning the case is that it was sold is for really no reason in the Reisha, because within the case of the field, there's no real difference. The reason is for the Seifa, because in the Seifa, in the case of Metaltalin, it's only if it's sold, because in that case, there's Yush and Shino Yerushos. Ask the Gemara 1 second. V'seifa nami. 1 second. You're telling me Shimon is allowed to give Eidos. That is not Yehuda's. Neheidim miyayish migufei midamel mi miyayish. Says the Gemara 1 second. Has Shimon been miyayish from ever getting monetarily compensated? Of course not. So why is he allowed to give Eidos? Why is Shimon allowed to testify in this court case? There's some level to give back to him. Says Gemara Light 6 lines down. Demeis Gazlin. The case is talking about where the Gazlin Ruvain died, and therefore Shimon can never get the value back. That's when he can give Eidos. The Tanakh we learned in the Mishnah. If someone sold something and gave it to his children, or he left it for them as an inheritance, the children are parted from paying once the father dies. So in this case, Shimon will never be able to get back his money. And that's why he's not Nogea B'Eidos, because he can never get anything back, and therefore he can give Eidos in this story. Says the Gemara of Elokim of Yerush. So why don't we just say a case of a Yerush? Why do we have to say the case that he sold it? Says the Gemara, then it's true that the Brisa had to talk about the case of a Mechira. Why? Because that's the only way that Shimon wouldn't get it back, because then there's Yosh and Shina Rishos. What's the reason that the Brisa spoke about a case where it was sold? Talk about a case of Yerusha. Void kasha. And says furthermore, Void kasha la'abaye, l'nei shachri yusa love. And Abaye was also bothered that the Brisa said, the Brisa should have just said that the chilik between the case of Karka and the case of Metaltalin, whether Shimon could give Eidos is whether there's a Chrayis. What is the reason why the Brisa said that it couldn't? Excuse me, I said it wrong. The Brisa said the reason is because of achrayis. It's not the nikuda, asks Abaye. It should have said whether or not he's going to get it back. So the Gemara is bothered the way the Rav Shish is explaining the Brisa. There's a flaw in Lashain according to Abaye, and there's a flaw in case according to Mandamar. Just like Yaresh is just like Keach. Why do we have to talk about a case of a like Keach? And therefore comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara gives a new pshat. It's a new pshat going back to the Brisa of yesterday of Mem Gimel. Rav Shishis gave one pshat, says the Gemara a new pshat. Ella Kideravin Bar Shmuel. 5 lines from the bottom. Da'amai Ravin Bar Shmuel Mishmei de Shmuel. Ha'amoicher sadel chaver shlei b'achrayis ein made lo yaleho. Someone sells a field without achrayis, and therefore he's not going to come back to collect from you. You're still not allowed to testify for him. Why? Because the Baal Chayv of the original seller will be able to get this field, and therefore the seller does have a vested interest, and therefore he cannot give edus. V'davka, and this is particularly a ba'isei sada. Avol para v'talis loy mibai. When it comes to items, then loy mibai bistama, as we turn over to Mem Daled Amid Beis, loy mibai bistama, that if they didn't make any mention that there is a chrayis, delay mishtabid lay, and therefore there's no shibud. My taima, what's the reason? Metaltalinu, and we know metaltal bal chayv loy mishtabid. And you can understand that Ravin Bar Shmuel, in his explanation over here, is going at lengths to fill in all the missing details that we had. That the chelik is that there's no, that it's metaltalin, and metaltalin is not mishtabid. Va'afal gav the cost of lay miglima dal kasvei. Even though in the shtar he wrote you could collect even from the clothing I'm wearing. Hani mil dis now beneyu. That's only if the seller has, the buyer has the items. But you cannot collect from mishubadim, and therefore, in a stam field, if there's no achrayis mentioned, then, and that is the case, the seller can give eidos. Why? Because it's not negate him at all. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Ella, even if they made these movable properties in abaytiki that you're going to collect specifically from them, nami loi, it's also not part of the shibud. My time, okay, the Rava. If you made an abaytiki and then you sell it, the Baal Chayv could collect from it. My time, what's the difference between an Eved and a Sharna Chamar? Highest lay kala, less lay kala. So if there's a call, one could protect himself from it. If there's no call, you're never going to be able to take yourself from it. And therefore, since the Baal Chayv cannot collect from the animal, even if it was an abaytiki, therefore the seller can give edus on this case because he himself is not going to gain it all, and that's going to weigh the Ravin Bar Shmuel, will explain the Brisa. So now the Gemara goes a little bit of a left turn, because we just said that even when it comes to an abaytiki, the halacha is that it cannot be collected from the para, from the glima, because there is no kol. Ask the Gemara 1 second. Why are we now worried? Why are we not worried that the seller gave over to the Baal Chayv a lien onto karka? Meaning, maybe he gave over the metalton agav the karka, and therefore, even though there's never going to be a shibud on metaltalin, but if the metaltalin was given agav the karka, then there is a shibud. Why? Damar Rabba. Rabba taught us, if you gave it over agav the karka, kani mikarkoi, and kani metaltli. So there is a way to create a shibud on metaltlin. You have to write a particular language that it's not a regular a samachta, it's not a tufsa dishtara, and rather their kinyan on the metaltlin is only agav the karka. So ask the Gemara, back to original question. We're trying to figure out what is the case that a seller could give eidos about his items. Says the Gemara, because it's not negayatim. Why is it not negayatim? Because these items are not mishobit. Ask the Gemara, what do you mean? Maybe the case was they were given agav karka, and then even though they're metaltlin, they are mishobit. Answers the Gemara, shalokach umachar la'alta. The case is the seller bought it and sold it right away, and therefore we're now worried that in the interim he utilized these items as a mashkoin, agav karka, and therefore there's no concern. Says Marvelechash Doma. How do we know Doma da'akni? Who? Maybe the seller took out a loan beforehand, and he said on something he's going to buy afterwards. Shmas mina. So says the Gemara, let's bring a raya from here to the sidebar. Din de'akni kana umachar. That if someone said a lien on metaltlin, that he will afterwards purchase. He purchased and then he sold it. Kana v'hoirish, or if he bought it and said he will give it as Yerusha, loy mishtabed. Says the Gemara, so we should be able to bring a raya from here that such a shibud is not possible. To make a shibud before the sale ever happens and say, when I buy something, this item should be the mashkin, it's not going to work. Because if it would work, the seller shouldn't be able to give edus in our case. Says the Gemara, loy tzricha de kamri edim. Yadana Bey. Says Gemara, no, you don't have a raya. So why in our case could the seller give eidos? Because there's specific eidim that said, we know that this guy who sold it never had any karka. If he never had karka, then he clearly could not have made the metaltlin mishobed agav karka. Says the Gemara, v'ha'amai Rav Papa. Asks Rav Papa, going back on the detail that karka is not, that metaltlin is not mishobed. Avgav dam rabban amachasad lecha ve'yosay b'chrayis obabal chayvetar ve'ino chayzer love nimseis sheinish shalai. But if we find that it was never his chayzer love and he backed out, so says the Gemara, chayzer love he can yes back out. So what do we see over here? The same thing should apply. Asks the Gemara by metaltlin, that if it's nimseis sheinish shalai, if it's found that he sold something that were stolen goods, then you're allowed to be chayzer. So says the Gemara, why does the same thing not apply by us? That we recognize that it's his donkey. Therefore, you can never say that was never his. For Rav Zvira Amar, no. Why? This is goofa. Why he sold without achrayis? You're coming back and telling me, wait, but it was never yours. I told you I'm selling without achrayis. You took the gamble. I'm sorry. Tough luck. That can be the case that seller can give eidos. Pick it up from here. B'siyata dishmaya.